Hey everybody, welcome back for another round of JS training, specifically in the can.js section. My name is Alexis Abril. I'm one of the developers over at Batovi. And with me today is the core lead for can.js, David Luke. Hey David.
Hi everybody.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about templates, templating engines, and the templating engine we use for can.js primarily. Something I didn't have on here is the history of templating engines. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that too. Originally, if you're following along in the schedule, this was a single-day session. I've broken this part into 2 sessions, so you'll see a little bit about can.stache this week and the next week. So we'll get a little bit more in-depth as we go on. Today, we're going to tack on to what we did last week. Last week, we did a little bit of an intro to can component, what web components are and how we create custom elements with can component. But today, we're going to talk about specifically how we handle markup within those components. So first off, I'm going to let Dave take the reins here. But David, could you tell us a little bit about what are these templating engines? You hear these terms like mustache, and we're going to be talking about stash and ERB and all these other things, and JSP. What is a templating engine?
All right, so I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to do a bunch of coding because that's probably the best way to actually show it. So that's actually a good question because in the end, the web still runs on HTML, static HTML that is in fact, and we mainly use JavaScript to modify that HTML in order to create a dynamic experience, right? And in order to do that, well, let's say we have an HTML page like this where we say hello world. And what templating languages help us with is the question of, well, what if I have, how do I bring this static content together with my data? What if I have data like this? Right? And there's a bunch of different approaches. I would say the main ones right now are, it all started with something like EJS, which I'm just gonna, like, can.js came initially with EJS. Actually, should we try an EJS template?
Oh, we don't need to go that deep into EJS, but talking about it would be...
Fair enough. So basically, it just said, well, let's do what kind of PHP does in JavaScript, where we just create some tags where you put your data in into like some special magic tags. So that was the first try and the first attempt. You can put any kind of JavaScript in here. And the problem is that you can't put any kind of JavaScript in there. So it kind of gets a little hard to figure out what belongs into the template and what belongs into your JavaScript itself. So that's how kind of like so-called logic-less languages came about. There's, I think, 2 schools of thinking right now. One is you do like Angular does, you do everything with HTML attributes and placeholders. And the other one is what we're doing based on a templating engine called Mustache. If you look at this here, and is the homepage gone? There it is. And what this does, it gives you mustaches where you can put in placeholders for your data. And then you have sections that either check if this value is truthy or go, if it's an object, go into, switch the context to that value, and then you can write your code in here. And this is basically what Stache still does. The mustache spec, it turned out, was a little almost too limited. So the next version of it is called handlebars. And handlebars looks kind of almost exactly the same, except for that you also get where are they? You also get helper or each. Can.stache is compatible with mustache and handlebars, but it also adds some other functionality to it, which I'm not sure if we're going to talk about today yet, but let's first look at it like simple template. So because we can just throw stache or handlebars templates into the page, we have to put them into a script tag. So we'll call it view. And then we say type text stache. So we added this here. And then I'm going to take this template. And then we have our data here. We can just like replace that with our placeholder for the message. And how you render it is you get the renderer. The renderer is basically a function that you pass your data to, and then it returns either a document fragment or the HTML string. So in our case, we want a renderer from the view. And then we can just append it to the body with jQuery render data. And as you can see, our data is already being rendered here. Now, this is definitely much better than having to do this with jQuery, right? Because with jQuery, you'd have to like create a span here, give it an ID or class, and then update that yourself. So this is a pretty good step forward. A nice thing about Stache also is, however, that we can make our data live. So instead of having to re-render every time, right? If I change the name here, it reruns the whole JavaScript and parses the template and then re-renders it. So instead of having to do this every time, we can also make it live binding by turning this into a map. What that does is it allows Stache to, well, automatically update when the property changes. Let's try this by adding it to the window, because then we can just, can we? Does JSON let us do that?
You'll have it. You can do it in the console, like not that console, the console tab.
Oh, you're right, the other one.
Yeah, because it's in a frame.
So we can say data.adder message world. And as you see, it changed automatically without re-rendering. What Stache did actually is only update this one node and document, like this little text part. So this is what we talk about when we mean minimal DOM updates. Instead of rendering everything, it just looks at what changed and then changes those things specifically on the page. So that was my intro to Stache and our templates. What are we going to hop in next?
So I see we're basically taking the content of this script tag. You have h1, hello, and then this special indicator for message. We're basically just using those two mustaches, those two curly braces, as like a placeholder. It's an indicator that says, replace this with some other data later on. In this case, the message property from your data object.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any reason we use two curly braces? Is there other special indicators we could use? What are some of the rules we got here?
So with the two curly braces, there is one thing that's important for mustache. It is that if you do something like this, you'll see that the text will be escaped. And the mustache spec also says that if you add a third curly brace, well, this is all bold already. Okay, maybe let's make it.
No. You're missing closing.
Yeah, I know. So if you use 3, thank you. If you use 3 curly braces, then it won't be escaped. It'll actually add the HTML, which you should use sparingly, especially with user submitted content, because people can put content on your page that you may not want. So I generally try and do the 2 curly braces. If somebody submits HTML, then it'll still be escaped and don't cause any issues with the user's browsers.
Cool. You also mentioned when you were talking about, hey, this is what Handlebars brought to the Mustache spec, this concept of helpers. What is a helper?
Good question. Let's try this. Let's add a list to it. We have Lexus, David, Justin. So now we have a list, and we want to iterate over that list and create an unordered list. Let me fix this. To do this, we use, well, an UL. And then we use the each helper, which we give the names. And then you close it like this. You just close it. This is a section. So you started with a number sign and then close it with a slash and then the name. And then that means we're going, and for every name, we create a new li that returns this or the current name. So this can be either called this or dot. It's pretty much the same. So this is a helper. Now, there's another thing. The if helper is probably pretty important too. Do you have a good example for what we can do for the if helper?
Not offhand. We could do you could just say after message, comma, you just say like is active or something to that effect.
Yeah, you're right.
That could just be a
Boolean. So we just say is active is true, and then we can just add this here and say if is active. Right, and then if I set this to false, the whole list is not going to show up. In fact, if I would add this dynamically in the console, data.adder is active false, it'll disappear automatically. The nice thing about Stache's each helper is that if I do something like, let's rerun this. If I do something like data.adder names, push, Matthew, it'll actually not re-render the entire list. It will just go and add that new item to the end of the list. And the same with names dot shift. So it'll take Alexis out, but instead of re-rendering the entire list, just take that one item out. So it's pretty smart about that, which is kind of cool and also really fast when you have bigger lists because it doesn't need to do a lot of re-rendering and recalculating.
This is an interesting example. You're kind of illustrating one of my favorite things about this whole process. If you look at the first pane, the HTML tab, we basically have all the rules for our presentation layer. So anything you want to, any rule you want to dictate on how data is rendered, how data is displayed, is all contained in that HTML or that Stache template. If you look at the JavaScript and console layers, this is basically our business logic. We're not actually manipulating DOM in any way. So if we went back in time 5 years, or I guess maybe even 10 years at this point, how you would say, hey, if an object has is active, show an unordered list. Well, you would have in your JavaScript, if the if this dot is active, then dollar $div dot append ul. Like you'd have to construct all of these elements programmatically on the fly. Whereas here, all we're saying is, hey, the data is this object. And if I say data.adder names, shift, push, pop, whatever, all we're doing is manipulating the object in the business logic, which I think is really, really cool. It makes really testable code, and you're able to separate your responsibilities.
I think that's the biggest shift in modern Java script application development, is from like a DOM-driven, message-based approach to a data-driven UIs that you compose by just giving it your data and then modifying the data. We talked about view models last time. That's exactly the idea. Your view model is a data representation of your UI, and then you modify that, and it'll do all the things for you automatically, which is really nice. And it changes quite a bit on how you approach building an app.
I agree completely. All right, so we have this data. We know we're taking this string from the DOM somehow, right? So we have this var render equals can.view pound view. That looks magical. Can.view, I assume, because I'm familiar with jQuery, I can tell it's a function. And basing just what I know about jQuery, that looks like a selector. Pound view looks like something with an ID of view that you're going to pass into this function, and it returns something you're assigning a renderer to. What is can.view return? What is it doing? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Okay, so like I already said, the renderer is basically just a function that you give your data, and then it will return either an HTML string, or, because it's faster, a document fragment. A document fragment is just a kind of like a detached DOM of your HTML string, if that makes sense. It's very fast to work with because it's not actually in a DOM yet, so the browser doesn't have to worry about repainting and all this stuff. So if you do anything like that, always use document fragments. And you could here also pass a file name, say like path to my view.stache, and we're probably just going to get an error because this file doesn't exist. So it tries to make a request. Just makes a request to path to my view.stache and then tries to load the content. This is great for during development. In production, there is a couple of tools like Steel or that can compile that I wrote for can.js that actually takes all those files and turns them into one single JavaScript file. But all it does in the end is it returns a renderer function that you pass your data to. If you wanted to use stache directly, you could also create a can.stache like this. Hello. So that you would pass your string, right? But you get the same functionality that you already have. Oops. So this is how you can create a stache template based out of a string. But what you get back is the same function, same kind of renderer function.
Awesome.
Did I miss anything here?
No, that looks good.
Okay, cool.
Could you show us how to use this? So we have this template. This is pretty awesome. We just learned about components and a little bit about templates last week. How would you use this template inside of a component? Like, this hello world is so awesome and I want to use it in a bunch of places. How would we kind of package this up?
All right, so let's create a new component. Can component.extend tag. We'll remember that from last time, my component. And then I guess we have a view model, and our view model in our case is kind of like this, right? So I'm gonna take this out and move it down oops, and move it down here. Doesn't like me tabbing, but I like my code formatted. Remove that. And then here we can just give it a template, and that template can just be a render function. So let's try the quick one for now. Again, h1 hello message. And those components, that's important. You can't just go, unfortunately, yet go in here and do this, sadly. But you can only use components in a Stache template. So we'd have to add it to our view like this. Now, if you run this.
You had a syntax error. A template's missing a comma.
Oh, thank you. I was about to look at the console. Oh, it still didn't like it. Component.
The one error that's left is probably just missing a semicolon. Oh, you're not actually using my component. Oh, you are. You are.
Let's look what happened here. I think there's an error somewhere, but I'm not sure where. So console say nothing. Reference data is not defined. Yes, because we don't need the data. There we go. Okay, so you just embed that component into your template, and then you can use it. Now because we looked at this already last time, so we can also create a new, let's copy this. We can create another script tag, right? And just call it my component. Type text-stache script. And then we move all of this back and use can view my component instead. Now let's try some nice functionality, since we've kind of done that a little bit with components, but we have an input and bind the value. We'll talk about that in a second. And bind the value to the new name property. And on change, we'll add. Now we can just add this method, say add function, and then say this.adder, because this will be converted into a map. So we'll do that in a second too. So this.adder names.push this.adder new name. And then we can say this.adder empty the new name property. So if I go in here, we'll see that every time I do a change, so change happens when I blur this input field, the name gets added to it. Now, before we talk about this a little more, let's do the right thing, because we talked about that in the component thing. This is almost kind of a recap of the component hangout. In reality, we want to have this view model functionality separate so that we can test it. For example, I want to be able to test this add functionality outside of having to instantiate the entire component. And we usually do this like this. We say view model is can map extend. And then we use the define plugin, which I included here, to define our default properties. So we have a message with a value. And And then we have is active, also has a value. And then we have the names, which also have a value. And then we have the add function, which we're going to add down here. And then we can replace this view model part with our actual view model that we just extended. Now, there is one problem here. This needs to be a can list, I think.
No, that syntax isn't going to work. The value can be a function.
No, there's a typo.
Oh, there we go. Oh.
So yeah, this is actually you're right. Let's do the right thing.
It could be
initial value should probably be a function, I would think.
Yeah. So the reason for those watching at home, you just saw it work without it being a function, and I just said, hey, maybe it should be a function, and it could be an array. It doesn't need to be a can list. That should work without it.
So the reason is that it's basic JavaScript almost. It's that if you set this initial value to a can list, it'll use the same can list for every instance of your view model. And what you really want it to do is to return a new one every time you create a new view model, right? So if you do the same thing now, if we should add Matthew without a typo, then we get this the same functionality again, but our view model now can be tested.
Actually, David, could you illustrate? So what David was talking about was if anybody was watching our initial intro to JavaScript sessions, this is in the prototype inheritance section. So be sure to rewatch that video if you're interested in what we're talking about. We're talking about shared properties on an object's prototype. David, in your ID view script template on the HTML side, could you put 2 instances of my component?
Oh yeah, okay, that's actually a.
And then let's show the broken version, and then.
So we say okay, first put that in a div, and then make a second one. That's actually a good idea. So we have 2 my components. We could even remove the message here and pass it in so that we see message. Right, we can pass another message. So this default value, this is the default value, but we can change the message as well. And then right now, it does what we'd expect, right? So you say, okay, here, it adds it to this component. If you change this back to this can list, instead of in a function like this, and I add it up here, you see that it got added down here as well. And the reason is that the prototype is sharing the same can list. So if you ever run into problems like that, this is probably the problem. And that's really, it can happen pretty easily, but if you're aware of it, it's fairly easy also to avoid. So we'll just return a new function that returns a new list every time.
Yep. Also, if you don't care about the default, if you just want it to be an instance of a can list, is there a shorthand for that?
Yes, indeed there is. So for the define plugin, you can also define the type. So now we'll remove the value. And once we don't have any typos anymore, we'll see it. So now this instantiates a new can list automatically. So
it's value, not type. Type will serialize it. Values, that's the default.
You're right. Thank you. Type is a serializer. Okay. Sorry about that here. So now it instantiates a new can list. If you didn't do this and try to add something, it would just say cannot read property push of undefined because our names property isn't defined. But if you set the value, then you can just add it right away.
That's a little bit of a teaser. We have a whole talk dedicated to the define plugin. I just wanted to show off a little bit since we're talking about lists.
It's actually really, really powerful and still kind of unique to be able to do all of that.
If you ever want to set business logics wrapped around the behavior of properties, this is where it's at. So it's pretty cool. Okay, thanks for taking that my little sidetrack there. You also showed off something really, really cool. This two-way binding abilities. You're saying, hey, when the input changes, change this value in memory, and when the value in memory changes, change this input's value. What's the pros and cons of that versus you have frameworks and view engines like Flux and React that are saying, hey, this is, it shouldn't be two-way bound, it should just be unidirectional-ish. I say ish because that's a very small part of what is actually happening behind the scenes. But is there any pros and cons to doing it this way versus doing it that way?
To me, there honestly has never been that much of a difference. It's one way to have great philosophical debates about something that in reality, right, what you do, and we say here at change, we'll add it. What you do if you didn't have the two-way binding, you would just say, okay, you get the context and the event, and then you just say, for us, this dot adder names a push event target value. Is it value? Let's see. No, it's not it. Let's log the event. There should be a jQuery event. Oh, it's a lot of stuff.
If you open up your DevTools, it'll show a nicer version of that.
What's the? There should be value, right? Event. Or it's the element. Sorry. You can just say element of value, I think. No, didn't work either. Getting errors. Nope. What to do? Come on. Target. Dang it. I thought I'm getting the HTML element here. That's the second one, because this is how React is doing it. So what I'm saying is, like, there isn't, to me in this case, if you have input elements, I don't think there's too much of a difference, because if a user types into an input field, you most likely want to update your application state, right? So having this done automatically is actually, I don't think, as bad as people make it sound like. And if you don't like it, then you can just listen to the event itself and update the value manually, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So everybody's basically, to simplify all the framework view engines into one little sentence, you need to put data into the DOM. Let's say change an input's value, something to that effect. And you need to get data out of the DOM. When an input changes, you need to listen to it. So either you set up the bindings manually, it changes some object behind the scenes at a global level, which is what React does, or if it changes some state at a component level, which is Angular, Ember, and can.js, understand that it's the same-ish mechanic. It's not, you still need to read the value, you still need to get the value. It's just, how do you wire it up? That's all the preference is.
Yes, and we've talked about this before, I think last time as well, is that it, dispatching events is what the browser does, and our whole life binding mechanism is event-based. So being able to, it's easy to figure out where an event came from because you get it in the stack trace. So it's not that it has any drawback figuring out like what was happening in your application, because in the end, every event changes your application state, which is then static at that point in time. So it's the same kind of thing. I know that Angular, at least the first versions, had like problems that you could like change the state in helpers. I guess you can do that in can.js too, which is actually where it might get tricky, but the concept of events and observables itself is not as terrible as everybody makes it sound like now.
Right, right. Is it possible, we used if and each in our component template. Can you write your own helpers?
Yes, let's write one. Hey, can.stache.register helper. What should we call it?
How about we're using names? How about a fancy name helper?
Fancy name. Right, and then we pass it a function that gets some options, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do. And then everything we want to pass to the helper as an argument comes first. So we have the name that we want to pass. And then let's say if name make return. So in this case here, we'll talk about this more next time, but in this case here, we'll actually get a compute. So we got to read that compute. We talked about computes already, right? Yeah, a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, sure did.
So we just say, okay, we'll make the bosses strong. Otherwise, return just the name. Oh no, I deleted the list. I don't think I'm going to get this back anymore. Okay, let's do this again. Return new can.list.
Well, you didn't have to do that. I mean, you could just type in their names manually.
Yeah, there. And then in our template, so we've now registered that helper called fancy name, and we'll just wrap it in strong. Now, one thing is that this helper needs triple curly braces because we're returning some HTML. But let's try this. So in here, we say fancy name dot, and everything blew up. This should work, right? Today is not my good day. Name is not a function. Okay, apparently this is only the name already. So now this is only double curly braces, and then sadly we need triple curly braces in this case. And then you can see that the name is bolded. This behavior actually might have changed in 2.3 before we used to get a compute here, but because you can do that now, we'll talk about that next time, you can declare specifically what you want to get. So this is our first helper.
So in 2.3, and we'll go into this in greater detail in part 2, which is next week, we have this concept of helpers, which is what we've had for since we released Mustache as an engine. And the arguments you get in Mustache are computed properties. They resolve, or they can be computed properties, I should say. They resolve to some value. Because we always had to execute the compute, rarely did we ever want the compute itself. We wanted the computed value to say, hey, if your name is Justin, wrap yourself in a strong tag. We typically just wanted the value. So we created simple helpers. So if you're looking at the docs and you're looking at Stache, there's helpers and there's simple helpers. simple helpers will resolve the compute for you, so you'll never get the compute. You'll always just get the name or whatever you're looking for, which makes life typically a little bit easier. Removes a lot of boilerplate. Some things we saw that David demoed, again, was the two-way binding and the ability to listen for DOM events. If you see the open paren on the input, open paren $change equals add, he's listening for a change DOM event. That's very similar to saying $input dot bind change for that specific input, not for all inputs, for that specific input. He's binding a change handler to this input. There's a lot of different things you can do. There's one-way binding, parent to child, references, DOM events, any events. There's all kinds of different bindings you can set up in the Stache syntax. If you're interested in hearing what all of those are, we're going to be going over those specifically in part 2 as well. In this, I believe that was a pretty good intro. We went over basic tags, hello world, how to use it with component, what Stache is. Is there anything else you wanted to show off this week, Dave?
I've been thinking about it, but I don't think so. I think this has actually covered all the basics, even though it seems like it's a lot. It's not really. One thing, maybe instead of using this, you can also use this to get the inverted. So the inverts, that's probably good to know as well. So if it's not active, let's see if there's anything else. You can render partials, but I'm not sure how we're going to do this without being able to load other files.
Right, we'd have to render, like we'd have to specify the module name and stuff.
Yeah.
You could, but I think it'd be more confusing.
Yeah, so I think we can leave it at this. It was a
cool.
Good intro.
Let me double check Gitter, see if we have any questions. If you're following along for the first time, you're welcome to ask us questions during these podcasts at any time in the Gitter chat, gitter.in/bitovi/js-training is where we're at. Other than that, oh, here we go. Let's see. We do have a question. Okay, there's a question from Mick. Hey, Mick, one of our colleagues at Bitovi. Can you bring up your JS bin again, David? Do you still have that open by chance?
Oh, share my screen? Yeah, of course I do.
So the question is, when you're saying this.adder names push this.adder new name, how is this.adder new name tied to the input element?
Right now, it's not at all because we took it out. This is how it's.
Yeah. So Mick, you may have missed it a second ago. We were talking about the two-way bindings. We just removed it because we were doing like some kind of live discussion about how different frameworks do things, but that's the two-way binding for new name. So new name doesn't actually exist on the view model, but it's just a string. So even if it's undefined, it just won't show anything.
I mean, we could set the new name to a default here, right?
Yeah, that'll work.
And then it would already show up.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's where the binding was being set up. We have another. Oh, there's not another question. That's just somebody messaging me in the can.js chat. Cool. Join us next week
for more Stache.
For more Stache. Myself, I'll be here. David will be here, and I believe Justin will be here as well. And if you're really interested, there's an older video on how can.stache works internally, but we're about to redo this as a lot of things changed in 2.3, and that is not coming up for probably 3 weeks. It will be, it'll be the second week in January is when we'll do the internals of can.stache. So this is all how do you use it with components in the next couple of weeks. If you want to see how it works internally, to get an even deeper understanding, come back in January or join us at any time in the Gitter chat room. That's it for this week. I'm Alexis. That's Dave. I don't know which way I'm pointing. He's to my left or right. And we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.